Chapter 12, The One True Goal. McWindStorm Arren. 15 moon turns. How fast time flew. Sometimes, I could no longer remember the images of my past, they do not seem to make any sense anyway. Events flickered inside my head, good and then bad, and more often than not, they would get so mixed up that I could no longer tell which ones made me proud and which ones shamed me. But one thought overshadowed the others: I have to hold Akea in my hands. Always. Days after the flood, Derellans were scattered all around the camp. While most of them had joined the soldiers in cleaning up after the flood, there were those who were too shaken to go back to their houses. Derella had never had floods in the past, and while fishing was an everyday toil among its people, and those who fished were terrific swimmers, there were still many who feared the waters. When the flood came, they took to the roofs as their only refuge. I walked into my tent, and Dogan, as well as my set of royal guards, followed me like they were my shadows. A girl entered, barely past her childhood, and bowed in front of me and knelt as though bowing was not enough. She put down the tray of food she was holding on a makeshift table. I stared at bananas, coconut, a few pieces of bread, and a black concoction that I could only assume was poison. There was no meat. "Stand up and hand me that mug of dark vial." The girl did as she was told. Her hand shook a little as she handed me the mug, trying her best to avoid my gaze. I eyed the mug and sniffed, handed it to Dogan, who took it without waiting for instructions. He knew what I wanted him to do. He smelled the mug before tasting the black liquid and told me, "Your Grace, this is coffee. Derellans are fond of this, and it's such a shame this has not yet reached the palace gates." "Very well," I said and drank. It was the right amount of bitterness, but it was not for me. Tea still suited me. I continued pacing around without paying any attention to the girl and her sorry tray. "We'll be leaving soon, Dogan," I said. "More troops are coming in to help Derellans. As I speak, they're probably entering the land. I have sent for healers, too." Dogan nodded and looked around. No soldier was lost to the flood, but it was not something to be proud of. After all, it was not a battlefield they were sent to, the journey to Derella was a rescue operation. A handful of healers roamed the camp by now. It was easy to spot them because of the flowing white robes they wore. Most of them were women, although a handful were men. I knew their talents would be wasted on such common wounds. The healers were reserved only for battles, but I could not contest what most of my generals suggested, that healers were needed here to pacify the rebellion. "Your Grace," a soldier who entered the tent said, kneeling before me. "Stand up," I said. "There's been a report. More bodies were found, but they appeared magically near houses without anybody ever remembering having moved them. As if," he paused, his eyes wide, "ghosts were lurking around." My forefinger fell automatically to that space between my nose and upper lip as I considered what the soldier said. I could not deal with ghosts because they were not living. Lightning would mean nothing to them. Flooding would also be futile. This was bad. "Who is spreading that lie?" I asked. "It's not a lie, Your Grace," the man continued. "Derellans think that the ghosts are helping them find their missing loved ones." I grasped the soldier's collar and pulled at it until his eyes were at the same level as mine. "You will stop this nonsense. There are no ghosts. The palace cares for Derellans. I am their only salvation, not some ghosts that don't exist." I hoped intently that those words sank in. I watched his eyes before letting him loose. He bowed. "Yes, Your Grace. To serve." He thumped a clenched fist against his chest twice before he turned around and got lost in the sea of people outside. There was nothing more I could do for Derella that the soldiers and healers were not doing already. I had walked back outside my tent and beckoned my soldiers to prepare to leave when a group of healers approached me. A woman with long brown hair knelt. "Your Grace, I would like to see if your men need healing," she said. The soldiers surrounding me looked fine to me. The ugly one was still ugly. Another stocky soldier had the scar on his face even before I sent him here, but I nodded curtly and left the healers to proceed with their tasks. I watched as the brown-haired healer passed by several royal guards before pausing beside Dogen. "Do you need healing in whatever manner?" she asked. Dogen smiled. The cratty annoyance was going to flirt with the healer. There was no hope for him. With a face like that, he could only ever flirt, no one would pay him mind. "Can you make me prettier?" he asked. Dogen's remarks always made me want to throw up. His jokes were so dry that they curdled my blood. I snorted and waited for the healer's response. "You can only be so pretty if your heart wills it so," she said. More cratty bull. I did not understand her exclamation, but to my astonishment, Dogen seemed to blush. The healer looked at the little boy hanging at Dogen's back. She played with him for a while. I broke their little moment. "Men, we're leaving. Gather around, and I'll start summoning the clouds," I said. From behind, I could faintly hear them, Dogen and the healer. "I'm Dogen Rhonda. What's your name?" The healer replied, "Amaya." I couldn't listen to this nonsense anymore. I lifted my arms and concentrated, gathering clouds around our feet, the mist growing cold all around us. This was home, a part of my being, and the coldness was a source of my strength. We lifted in the air, and when we were high up, I took one look at Dirella. This place would rise again, and the people would never forget that it was the Canellan Palace that rescued and gave them a second chance in life. Whatever rebellion that initially stirred would be forgotten. The healer was looking up at us. Then beside me, I saw Dogen smiling, waving at the healer. We moved forward. Another half day of traveling in the air to learn about Lamare's plots. Or rather, my own. While waiting for Lamare, things spiraled inside my head. When she handed me the scroll, I would have to read it word for word to understand it all fully without ignoring the minute details because she could have hidden a code somewhere. I did not want to lose in the game I had so carefully conceived. I would not let myself be beaten, especially not by a woman. I closed my eyes and felt myself relax involuntarily. She is here, I thought to myself. "Saul," I said. "Please, show yourself." I heard a soft gasp from somewhere in the shadows, and then Saul emerged slowly from behind the curtains. My lips curled downwards to show my disappointment. "What do you think you're doing?" Saul was composed as usual. "Your Grace, the windows were open. I checked on them to ensure that nobody from outside would hear your discussion later." Good reason, but I did not believe her. Regardless, it was believable enough that I had no reason to have her bound in chains and thrown into the Canellan dungeons. "Lamare is coming. Please see yourself out," I said harshly. Her eyes regarded me one last time before she bowed down and turned around. Saul was the piece of me that I will always take to heart whenever I lose myself. I needed her, but not today. I watched as she left the room. Dogen was standing guard by the door, which was unusual for him. Usually, he would wait for Lamare and bring her here himself, but not today. Dogen stood motionless with his unreadable face. The ugly child was not with him, and I wondered where he was. Footsteps from outside the chambers grew louder, and I leaned forward on my throne. Dogen opened the door and announced, "The royal scribe Kino Amark is here, Your Grace." I nodded to him and looked at Lamare. When she was down on her knees, I took the scroll from her and started reading.